I made sure there weren't any children there because it was very spicy. And you can't get around that. It was very spicy. And fortunately, no children were in attendance. Now, today's subject is much more placid. I hope you don't fall asleep. I will try to make it as interesting as possible. This is a very interesting community, and as my friend said, we're all very proud of this community. It has a wonderful history, and you're active members in the successor to it, but the original community looked quite different, I think. And we will get to the very beginning of it all because it has such a fabulous backstory that I would like to share with you. To give this talk, I really did quite a bit of research. You really got me to spend a lot of time reading all kinds of things and gathering material, and I'm so glad you did, because every little bit of history that we have of our beloved Croton and Mount Airy is a part of it. It is valuable. I'm using these cards, and they're very helpful. The history of the Mount Airy colony, also called Mount Airy Community or Mount Airy Association, would not exist without Harry Kelly. This is probably someone you've never heard about, but he was the founder, and like a benevolent ghost, he is up there somewhere guarding all of us here. I'm part of you because we lived in the colony, first on Park Trail and then on Mountain Trail for many years while we were building our own house on Hessian Hills Road. Let me tell you about Harry Kelly. When we moved here in 1953, that was the year he died. A lot of people said, "Did you ever meet Harry Kelly? Or did you know Harry Kelly?" And we didn't know who they were talking about. But he was sort of like a saint. He was so beloved. And he was sort of like Gandhi, you know, so a saintly figure, revered by the old anarchists who were the heart of this community. He was not native. He came from the Midwest, from a poor background. He wandered, tried to gather experiences, grow up and all of that, find himself, became a printer and a salesman for printing equipment. And this brought him in contact with the labor union movement. We're talking of the mid to end of the 19th century. In the beginning of the labor union movement and many other progressive and radical movements. In the labor union movement, he came for the first time in touch with anarchism. And it lit a fire in him. He became very preoccupied with the ideas and ideals of anarchism. So that eventually he went to England. The reason was that in those days, England was a big center of anarchist philosophers and activists. Prince Peter Kropotkin lived in London, and he is one of the most important theoreticians and philosophers, activists of anarchism. His book, Mutual Aid, I recommend to you. Kelly became a student, a disciple. Kropotkin, an aristocratic Russian whose family at one time provided leadership in Russia before the Romanovs, an old aristocratic family who owned huge pieces of land. As you know, that's what Russia was for centuries. His father owned vast properties and had 1,200 male serfs. Kropotkin became deeply moved by the fate of the serfs. While they were not exactly like American slaves, nevertheless, they really couldn't do very much. They couldn't really own land, they couldn't really go to school, they were kept in a kind of, they did all the labor, and the landowners had a wonderful time. And when you read Russian literature, you'll know all about it. I recommend Chekhov. Kropotkin had been, for his ideas, he had been exiled. He spent many years wandering in Europe for 41 years. This was the price you paid in those days for having unconventional ideas, let's put it that way. At least he wasn't sent to Siberia. Maybe his name protected him. I copied out some words that Kropotkin said because I want you to fully understand what the classic anarchism was all about. Kropotkin advocated a decentralized communist society. Communist not in the Marxian sense, but in the sense of shared land, everything, people owned everything together, communally. That's what it really means. Decentralized, small communities, free from central government, and based on voluntary associations, self-governing communities, and worker-run enterprises. Now, this is very far from some of the other big ideas that circulated at that time in Europe: communism, socialism, and other isms. This was a very peaceful, placid, idealistic idea of how people could live together and help each other without government. That is the basics of classic anarchism. It's very appealing. It's like a paradise, isn't it? Of course, this philosophy appealed to the serfs who wanted to throw off the yoke of the landowners, but peacefully. Marxism was violent. Marx advocated class warfare. Anarchists never did. There were isolated people who went bonkers and threw bombs and all that. They are not representative of anarchism. Tolstoy was an adherent. This is a philosophy that appeals to the poor, to the disenfranchised, the powerless. And of course, it appealed to the Jews in the big Russian Empire, which encompassed Poland as well, and other countries. Jews were not considered citizens. They couldn't go to the schools. They couldn't enter all the professions. They were kept down. But they had to be in the army for many, 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 many years. One reason for the enormous outflow and immigration from Russia and Poland. But I see parallels with the old original Christians in the Roman Empire. Christianity appealed, and there were millions of poor people in the Roman Empire. They were all wealthy, with slaves and toilets that were preheated by having slaves sitting on them first, all that kind of thing.
I thought you were going to keep it
I
clean.
saw that in Ephesus. I couldn't believe it. I mean, the marble toilets, and they had the slaves sitting there first. Anyway, these are just, never mind. But this was the enormous appeal of Christianity, because there were so many poor people. And they banded together in small communist communities, shared everything, helped each other, and their motto was as well, mutual aid. So anarchism does have a lot of similarity with early Christianity, as many of the idealistic communities do. There is this great wish that people have, if we could only all live together in peace and harmony and help each other and be happy. It's not so easy. As a matter of fact, I think the phrase mutual aid is probably sort of the real foundation of anarchism. I'm up to number 3. Now Kelly, we're back to Harry Kelly, who was fired up by all of these ideas that he absorbed in England from Kropotkin and others, came back to the United States and wanted to help found such idealistic communities. And he did. First, he founded the Francisco Ferrer Association, an anarchist organization created to establish schools in America based on the ideas of Ferrer. Who was Francisco Ferrer? He was a Spanish activist, anarchist, theorist, teacher, educator. Spain was almost as oppressive a society as Russia, almost. And of course, with the Catholic Church being extremely powerful in Spain, Ferrer started a school with his ideas. And he wanted to expand this kind of education, a network of secular, private, libertarian schools. And he started in Barcelona. And these schools were to provide secular, libertarian curricula as an alternative to the religious dogma and compulsory lessons common in the Spanish schools. In his school, he abolished punishments, but also rewards. In other words, children were treated as equals. No exams. Practical experience was valued higher than academic study. His school hosted lectures for adults. He established a school for teacher training and a radical printing press which printed textbooks. It caught on in a big way, and about 120 schools were founded, mostly in Catalonia, of which Barcelona is, of course, the capital. This alarmed the authorities and the Catholic Church, and they sought ways to curb him. And the only way they could actually do it was to arrest him, which they did. Then there was a fake trial. He was convicted and executed. This is how dangerous ideas can be. He was the first martyr to progressive education. There have been others, but he was the first. And it outraged people all over the world who were sympathetic to his ideals. And as a result, more schools were founded throughout Europe, some and in America, and even in Brazil and Asia, in his name.
Cornelia, what year was that?
1914. No, Ferrer was executed in 1909. And Kelly founded a colony and a school in 1914 in Stelton, New Jersey. I'm sorry David Bluestein isn't here. He promised he would come. But, you know, his father, Abe, was a product of the Stelton School. He went to the school and he was a product of that colony. And he lived here in the colony for many years with his wife, Selma. We'll talk about it more maybe later. But they were a wonderful couple, steeped in the ideals of anarchism. The school lasted till 1953, and no surprise, this was the McCarthy era, in which many such progressive institutions folded because of splits between the members. Some were more liberal and some were more doctrinaire. Some people accused others of being communists, and communists called others fascists. You can't have a lovely institution under those circumstances, and they usually go under. Of course, that happened to the Hessian Hill School as well, which folded even earlier in 1952. But we're going back to the heyday in the early years, 1914 and on. Stelton was the longest lasting and the most important of anarchist settlements in the United States. After having done that, Kelly founded the Mohegan Colony outside Peekskill, which is bigger than our colony and lasts in, at least in title, to this day, but I don't think people are really that active anymore as a community. And then he founded the Mount Airy community. So you see why he was so revered. He was sort of like the father and grandfather of the whole thing. Kelly was a friend of two of the most prominent anarchists in America, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. They were very well known then in political circles and elsewhere, and were sort of also saintly figures in the movement. I remember Hilda and Sam Adele were close friends of ours for many years until their deaths, and they had photos of Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman prominently displayed in their living room. That was very important to them. Unfortunately, there were some people, as I mentioned before, who threw bombs and gave a bad name to anarchism. And the government got terribly excited, and you may have heard of Attorney General Palmer in those days right after World War I, and he wouldn't have any of it, and he clamped down on people. There were people killed, there were people imprisoned, and maybe the most famous were Sacco and Vanzetti, who were executed later, accused of anarchism. The general public didn't really understand what anarchism was. And I think they don't today either. It kind of has a bad name. I think Trump used it one time. He said, oh, you know, all those anarchists. He said, you don't know anything about it.
Cornelia, wasn't there a famous bombing? Mooney was accused, and that was blamed on the anarchists, wasn't it?
Who was accused?
A fellow by the name of Mooney, I think.
Oh, I didn't.
Yes. Well, there were
And he was
quite
in
a few
prison.
people who were badly treated, but the Congress passed an anti-anarchism act, and under that, both Goldman and Berkman were deported back to Russia. It's sort of like today, they're taking people in planes and send them back to Honduras or wherever, because they don't want the refugees to come in. So then they took many of the anarchists and took them back to where they came from.
Well, even if they didn't come from Russia, they sent them there, right?
Yeah, but that's where these two at least came from. They were deported in 1918. Now I wanted to tell you a paragraph that kind of distills Kelly's philosophy. He sought to establish an anarchist society founded on voluntary association in which coercion and authority would be replaced with personal freedom, individual autonomy, and mutual aid. That really does sum it up. he also wrote, "Anarchism is an ideal to strive for." Sort of reminds me of democracy. But it requires patience, so does democracy, and fortitude in an uncanny degree to live it. You just always hope that some people will actually manage to do it. It would be wonderful. But he translated his longings into deeds and worked to realize his ideals. Now, I'm saying here that I don't know the exact date of the founding of the Mount Airy colony, but in the meantime, I got this document from Alex Dyer, who has this in his possession, and it actually documents the founding of the colony incorporation in 1927. So we now have the date. I'm so happy. It's very difficult to do research in this area. There's very little material around. Our historical society, of which I'm a trustee, by the way, has very little material on the Mount Airy Association and on Mount Airy generally, because they didn't accept Mount Airy for many years as part of Croton, so they didn't collect anything. That has changed over the last few years, I'm happy to say. So the incorporation is in 1927, and until then, Kelly tried to attract people to come to this ideal community. He had a land holding company called Airy Hills Company with headquarters in Manhattan, and he started to sell small plots. And fortunately, we have copies of some of these ads. You will be very interested in hearing this. These are all ads that he placed in New York newspapers. When you're tired of subways, skyscrapers, Babbitts, and machine-made civilization generally, come to look at Mount Airy at Croton and Hudson. It is a beautiful place and conveniently located. A fine social life can be created. One thing to remember, however, is that the people are liberals, radicals, artists, and thinking people. Do you belong? I love it. I love it. Couldn't be funnier. Enquire Harry Kelly, 75th Avenue. Mount Airy, a new colony for artists and radicals. 54 minutes from Grand Central Station, frequent expresses. 2 miles to Harmon Station, 3 miles to beach. 1/4 acre of high, dry, and well-wooded land. Each $250 to $400. With improvements, water, road, and electric light, $525 to $575. Address Harry Kelly. In the beginning, this was, of course, going to be a self-sustaining colony. And they would have had to have their own water supply and maintain their own roads and bring in electricity, and people had to all pitch in and pay their share. And you can imagine that that didn't always go so smoothly. And that's where a lot of idealistic communities start to. People start bickering and not doing their share. When money becomes involved in the whole thing. If cooperation has a weakness, it lies in the unwillingness of men and women to share the responsibilities of others. The combination that works best is where individual freedom and financial responsibility exist with like-minded men and women grouped together in a small area. Mount Airy furnishes such a combination, a community based upon individual freedom and voluntary cooperation, and so on. I can pass this around. It's really so lovely to have. Oh, here we are. Now you'll notice that in these ads, however he describes the people that he wants to attract, he doesn't say anarchism. As a matter of fact, he doesn't mention any ideology. It's sort of a very broad spectrum of people. But those people who were anarchists in the metropolitan area and beyond, who read these ads, knew that this was where they wanted to be. And that's why most of the original settlers, and for a long time, were anarchists. But it didn't exclude anyone else. So who else came? Communists, socialists, and the communists, of course, split in two when Trotsky and Stalin had their big fallout. So there were two kinds of communists, socialists, and radicals of all stripes. Artists, yes, because they're usually individualists, so-called liberals, romantics, oddballs, you know what I mean? So it was always a mixture of people. In a way, I'm sorry to say, that was sort of was the seed for later struggles, because if they had all been anarchists, they might have gotten along better with each other, but they really didn't. And by the time we moved to Croton in 1953, there were many neighbors who weren't on speaking terms with each other anymore. There were people very angry with each other about ideology. There was a lot of bad feeling, not only between Mount Airy and the village, which didn't help, but within the community. But I think the power of anarchist thinking did persist from the beginning and held through for many, many years, although I think many of the anarchists changed their ideas later on when they realized that it was a dream. It was a dream that couldn't be made real. I think it was a kind of a sad realization with many of them. Of course, in the meantime, the older people were dying off, the houses were bought by young couples who were not particularly interested in any of these ideologies, and the population of these groups changed. I talked before about the burden of living in a self-sustaining community and having to, I think garbage was another problem. So they gave up on that very quickly, and in 1930, with everyone voting for it, or most people voting for it, they agreed that the village of Cotton should annex the community, which they did. So then the village of Cotton took over the roads, the electricity, the water, the garbage. So the anarchists didn't have to worry about that anymore. So when I smile, it's because I think of Sam and Hilda, those tiny little people in that tiny little house who were our dear friends and substitute grandparents for our children, and who were still so animated and inspired by their idealism. Most of the anarchists who were the first settlers were Russian Jews. They were, on the whole, very small because, you know, Jews in Russia were treated very, very badly, as I mentioned before. But also, not only the oppression, but the nutrition was so terrible. So they were usually very small. And you see that all over the world, you know, where people are oppressed and where they get little to eat, they remain small. In a place like California, where people are free and where they have the sun and the mountains and the snow and everything's free and wonderful, people grow very tall. It has a real bearing on people's physique. Now, these people, of course, were very poor, and they may have scraped together the $250 for a quarter acre, but they also had to live some. And what they did is they ordered tiny little houses from Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward. These were prefabricated cabins. They were very popular, not only here, but in other parts of America. But there are more houses here that started out with one of those prefabs, and then, depending on the skill and strength and vision of these various people, they added to it this way and that way, and they did this and that, and often very poorly thought through. And Laura was just telling me that her house shows signs of having been put together in a very unconventional way. So at the kernel of many of the houses here, you will find a Sears Roebuck or Montgomery Ward cabin. Certainly the Adells. Now, that old lady lives there now, and I don't know their names.
Who lives in
You mean the artist that used to live there?
Dorothy.
Dorothy and,
I don't know their names.
Oh, Hollywood tried me.
Ollie and Dorothy.
Ollie and Dorothy, she died.
She passed
Oh, she
away.
did. Has the house gone to somebody else now?
No.
He's still there.
Okay, well, that certainly had one of these cabins at
But
its center.
she told me one time about some of the interesting artifacts in this. Sam Adele was an enormously clever craftsman.
Yes,
And he even made the windows. I mean, he didn't go down to lumberyard and buy a window, but I mean, you actually put together these small strips in a frame to
Yes,
make the windows. So he made it, he added on whatever Sears Roebuck had to offer. I mean, it was very much his house.
yes.
And
Well,
he did, yeah. I mean, one of the things he did in the thirties, which I don't think I saw till much later in my life, was like two corner scummed cabinets. And he made a circular thing that you can spin, so the things that you put in the back of this corner cabinet are accessible. I think he invented that 10 or 15 years ago.
I wouldn't be
He was a very
surprised.
ingenious. But he did not manage to do stairs. And so forth. That was different.
Oh, by the way, Kelly wrote a letter to Dr. W.E.B. Dubois, called Du Bois, the very prominent scholar, African-American activist and teacher, a public figure. And I saw a copy of that letter. It was very much like the ad I read about, are you tired of living a city life? And I think he was probably hoping that some African Americans would join the colony. Did they? I don't know. We don't have a list of the original settlers, or even of people who came early on. There were several waves of settlers. And they changed, of course, over the years. There were fewer and fewer anarchists and more of others. But in any case, I wanted to read to you a paragraph from the Constitution of the incorporation. What is it called? Yeah, it says Constitution and Bylaws. Object of the Mount Airy Community Incorporated shall be to promote social and intellectual intercourse, social and physical improvement, to foster friendship, benevolence, goodwill, ethical culture, and the spirit of mutual helpfulness and progress among the members of the Airy Hill Colony, Town of Cortland, Westchester County, State of New York. Isn't that lovely? I hope you incorporate that into your own corporation. Can't go wrong with that. Now, in 1930, when they gave over the physical aspects of the community to the village, here is a list of the streets that were involved. Riverview, Sunset, Park, Grove, Ledge Loop, Valley, Hill, and Brook.
Where's Grove?
Yeah.
And Hill.
I think other streets must have been added later.
Where's Memory Lane?
More mountain?
Maybe it was renamed,
Yeah.
you know.
Maybe that was
But-
really Grove.
But it is important to remember that when they did that, they exempted the playground that was never given to the village of Croton, that remained a communal part of the Mount Airy Association to this day. And that's a wonderful thing. That was one of Harry Kelly's ideas, that there should be a communal playground. And I'm glad it has survived. My talk was supposed to be at the playground. I wanted to discuss a few people whom we knew well when we lived still here. Tom Poindexter and his wife Herma, they lived in a little shack at the intersection of 5 corners. You know, there's a modern house there now with a garage. That garage, that was their house. There's still a masonry wall there.
That was,
It was little more than a cabin, really. Poindexter was a surveyor. There are many stories about him, and none of them are complimentary. He apparently surveyed this whole area and others beyond, and there were more things wrong and more, I don't know about lawsuits, but disagreements and trouble between neighbors because he did such a terrible job of surveying.
but they named Herma Brook after her, right? The
What's
brook-
that?
The brook going by our house is called Herma Brook.
Really?
Uh-huh,
Yes, it was named
Oh,
for his
really?
wife.
yeah.
It meanders down from Mount Airy, and then its only open section really is behind our
Oh,
house.
yeah,
And
okay.
behind the Von Sauer property, as it heads down to Grand Street. So that's all Herma Brook.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
I can only add that my house was badly surveyed. He was reputed to have been drinking heavily the night he drew the lines between properties. When it was, the village took over. The village insisted there be some property lines for taxation purposes. And he missed 10 feet behind my house, or really between what is now the Harwain house and behind there. And an enormous argument on who owed the taxes on that 10 feet for many years.
Right. That's very typical of the kind of stories I've heard.
You know, it's funny, because when we worked down, we had the town survey, at the line, our property goes like well into the middle of memory lane, like, what the heck in the heck, there's a street here, and that's supposed to, you know, so clearly it was not drawn well, maybe he had a few drinks before he came out.
The meetings of the association were held at the Poindexter House. I remember going to one. Like, we weren't property owners, we were just renters. So we didn't have a vote or anything. But I wanted to see what it's like, and what was left of the association then met there in that little shack. We knew, of course, Sam and Hilda Adele were wonderful friends. Jack and Ruth Cronick, who lived at the very end of Park Trail. I think they were not original settlers, I think they came later. Jack was a principal of a school in New York. He and his wife retired. They were wonderful people and helped us, an impecunious young couple, with everything. Ask Jack, that kind of thing. And they lent us money too, without interest. Now that was it just nice, or was it because they were anarchists? Or both? A lot of the people here were so nice. The house we first rented, which isn't there in its original shape anymore, the Nicotopolis lived there now, it was a small house, was owned by the Bluesteins. And as I mentioned before, they were both dedicated anarchists. Although Selma, when she was young, was a dedicated communist, but when she met Abe, he easily won her over. They took their anarchism seriously, and during the Spanish Civil War, as you may recall, Catalonia was the last province to fall to Franco. And Catalonians fought like crazy. And that was the seat of anarchism in Spain. They wanted to go there as witnesses, and they did. Abe and Selma went to Barcelona to witness the Spanish Civil War. And it was gruesome. It was terrible. Selma couldn't, she was a wonderful artist, great artist. She couldn't, they were speechless with horror. And their experience were so devastating. But they felt they had to bear witness. That's how deep-seated their faith in anarchism was. And eventually, they couldn't stay. They had to come back on one of the last ships. And it was a lasting trauma for everybody, but of course, for them as witnesses, sort of never quite got over that. And Selma later, much later, when she could think again, did some artwork about that experience. They were the ones who rented us their house for a minimal sum. They knew we didn't have any money. And they wouldn't take money from poor people. They were so nice, wonderful people. They had to move to Harmon into a bigger house because they had 4 children and they were bursting at the seams in this little house they had. And they had 3 boys in the attic, and they also had her own room. And eventually, when the children had left, they came back and bought the house next to their former house, which is now owned by somebody who built a whole big house in back of it.
Right.
You know, the old Bluestein house, there's just a little bit left in front.
It was then it was the Thallinger house.
Yes,
Yes.
the Thallingers lived there when it was a tiny little house.
We always called it the Mother Hubbard house, because it looked like a shoe with that back.
Yeah, yeah.
And they had that section growing up, yeah.
Thallinger was also a very, very good artist, by the way. And
Which house is that now?
If you come in Park Trail, it's the second one on the right, is it? That little white.
you see sort of a
third
little,
house on the right.
Where Hallie
jutting
and
house.
Zach was,
Yeah,
and now.
Oh, that
okay.
was
Yes.
Zach's house.
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
He was also a very idealistic person who lived in another world, kind of. He was very influenced by social realism. His art was strictly social realism. And our library owns a bronze he made, and somewhere there is a painting of his around in Croton. They were so poor, and he sculpted. He was a sculptor. His estate is in the National Archives in Washington, by the way. I could tell so many stories about that. But he finally got a job. He got a job that paid. He got a job making mannequins for a dressmaker company of likenesses of Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor.
Yeah.
And he had never heard of them.
That's great.
Yes, some people live in a bubble. I hope he got the job though. There was Sam Potashnik. Does anybody remember him? He was quite a dedicated member. And the Millers owned Mountain Trail, and I think they were very convinced communists. There's a funny story. She claimed to have been mistress of Sergei Eisenstein, which is, can't be true because he was gay. But she lived in Russia first. But they used to park their car in the street. And if you know, Mountain Trail is very, very narrow. Very, very narrow. One car, that's all, you know, and then you have to kind of go sideways in the bushes to let somebody pass. And the phoners, does anybody remember the phoners?
They were our neighbors.
Yeah, Philip and Rosalind. And they were perfectly at home with being communists, Marxists also they called themselves. And they lived at the end of Mountain Trail, and Phil was always upset because the Millers parked their car on the street and it was hard to get around them. Phil, of course, was a very well-known writer, historian and writer about the history of African Americans and the labor union movement and other radical movements. A ceaseless writer and teacher. And he was invited by the Russian Soviet government, a free tip to Russia. They loved his books there. And but Phil, he was our landlord for many years. We lived in a tiny little cabin behind their house. And he had a good sense of humor. And he sent the Millers a card. Don't park your car in the driveway. Sincerely, Nikita Khrushchev. From Moscow. I think that's hilarious. Yeah, there were some communists with a sense of humor. There were the Katowices. Does anybody remember them? Yes. I think they were probably latecomers, but wonderful people. And she was a wonderful photographer and a teacher. The Biddlemans, now Alexander Biddleman was one of the
I live in their house.
oh,
Yes.
one of the people
Biddleman
who
made all
went
my
to
curtains.
prison because he was a communist. And he was proud of his ideas and ideals. He didn't hide it. He paid a very heavy price. In those days, people were arrested and put in prison for their thoughts. He hadn't done anything, but he spent several years in prison. Ironically, the Communist Party had kicked him out. He wasn't even a member of the Communist Party anymore, because through all the byways of Stalin's thoughts and the whole Russian ideologies which changed every year, he wasn't with it all the time. And so they felt he wasn't loyal. And he was excommunicated from the Communist Party. But it was still, for neighbors, even if they didn't share any of his thoughts, it was a shock that someone they all knew and who was apparently a perfectly nice person, I never met him, would end up in prison for his beliefs.
I represented the author Howard Fast,
Yes,
who was also a great communist, and I told, when I moved here, I said, Howard, you might know this guy, I forget his name, it's Alec Bitterman or Biddle, and he takes my face in his hands and he goes, "You live in hollow ground." Allie Beetleman was our grandfather. He was the chief cultural ideologue of the Communist Party. I've been in your house with Paul Robeson singing in the backyard.
Oh, wow.
yeah.
It was like, oh, great.
Well, it was
Didn't he
hard
also
to,
end up on a house arrest in your house for the last years of his life?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's you can still see it, right out at the end of your driveway, and the driveway going up to Vines. There are 2 cement footings, where the FBI had a gate. So every time the Beatles, they would sit in your driveway, or the driveway across Vines driveway, and they had a little hut. And every time the Beatlemans wanted to go shopping, the FBI guys would open the gate, the Beatlemans would drive out, they would follow them out, they would follow them down to the store, they would come back, they would lock the gate, but the cement footings are still out there.
They are.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Well,
hilarious.
yeah, there are many stories about the FBI and this community. I've often told the story of how the FBI came to us and wanted us to spy on our neighbors and friends, the foreigners. And we said no. And they tried to get us to become spies for them. And eventually they got frustrated and said to my husband, Bill Cotton, we have a file on you. They thought they could intimidate him. So Bill said, I'd like to see it. So they had to go to the car and get the file. And he saw his file, and every last word in it was wrong. All the dates, all the names, all the events where you're supposed to, why the FBI even took an interest in him, we've never really known, because he was never a member of the Communist Party or active on behalf of the Communist Party or anything of the kind. He was on the WPA, like thousands of millions of artists, and he was a member of the Photo League, which was put on the Attorney General's list as a subversive organization. It was just photographers who wanted to have their own organization. But finally, the FBI man said, he was about to slam the door, he said, "You goddamn liberals." And from then on, we always called ourselves goddamn liberals. But they didn't get anywhere with us. And the funny thing is, when I told this once in public, Bob Reibel was there. And Bob said, "You don't know this, but the FBI came to us and they wanted us to spy on you." So, there was a lot of that going on then. Fortunately, this is America, and you do have some protections. There's one other, there's Vic Perlow, a latecomer, of course, also a communist economist. He was a very brilliant man. He used to write letters to the Times. They were excellent. Couldn't agree more with him. He'd say, look, the budget, you don't have money for this, you don't have money for that. To take care of people's needs, tax the rich. Have a progressive income tax. It's very simple. There'll be enough money to take care of everybody. He was a very interesting man, and I know his wife lived to be quite 103, I think. And he and Phil Forner used to walk and talk because they knew that their houses were bugged. So they talked in the open. It's an aspect that we don't even think about, that kind of thing. Now, I've come to the end of my talk. And you notice that I spent a lot of time on the pre-Mount Airy and then the early Mount Airy, and not so much on the later, because I wanted you to have a good background feeling for how this thing came to be, and the great spirits who were behind it, who made it happen, and who are, I hope, still with us.
And yet the book on Croton has none of this in it.
No, well, very little. It was too controversial, and
So that history that you're telling us now is
Yeah.
kind of lost.
well, you know, many years ago, I dared in my little gallery to have the first exhibit ever of They Lived in Croton, and I included some of the radical artists. It was controversial. I mean, you couldn't even, you had to be prepared that people say things. But the most incisive was when an elderly man came in who got to be my friend. He taught me a lot about Croton history. But when he found out that I live on Mount Airy, he said, "That's a road I've never taken yet, and I never will." There was such bad feeling between the village and Mount Airy for so long. It was really a terrible shame. And it wasn't until some of the ministers got together, I think Rabbi Robinson took the lead, and he got Father Wayne of the Episcopal Church and Reverend Gottwald, and I forgot who the Methodist minister was at the time, but it had to take ministers to come together and say, we've got to do something about these terrible splits in our community. It's not right. It's so awful. It estranges people from each other. There was trouble in the schools. There were, some attacks on kids from communist families, and there was so much bad feeling. Someone told me that the little boy of the Kaplan family, was it Kaplan? And they were prominent communists, and he had they had a birthday party for their little boy, and only one child came. Children.
When was this that the ministers got together with the rabbi?
This was in the late 40s and early 50s when the communist.
An interesting story in the schools. Lois Simonson was a friend of mine. Some of you may have known her.
I had her as a
She came
teacher.
here to teach here in the late 40s, and she was handed a list of people by the superintendent and hiring her, and said, should any of these people ask you to their house for coffee or for dinner, you would be well advised not to accept the invitation.
How about that?
Wow.
Well, anyway, thanks are due to those ministers. I know that, and the Catholic priest too. They got together and got things rolling. And then there were all faith Thanksgiving festivals or whatever. And they kind of started all just to get the religious people together. Of course, a lot of the radicals weren't religious, so they were. And I think that's still true. But it was a beginning. It was a beginning, and it softened everything. It was nice to know that there were people who did care. Bill and I, we were just people. We couldn't do very much, but I remember an incident when the Friends of Music, which started here, you know, the wonderful music concert series, which still exists now in in Tarrytown, North Tarrytown, that started here on Mount Airy. People got together and started Friends of Music. And in the early days, we went, recitals were given at the Pierre Van Cortlandt originally school. Chamber music, and it was not on stage, but everybody sat around on the same floor, the way chamber music should be played. And we went with the Fauners. They like classical music, and so we went together. And there are the Schatzkins, who were very pronounced socialists and great enemies of the communists, really. And they had, of course, didn't acknowledge each other's existence, much less be social or anything like that. And we were friendly with both. So we're going in there and with the Fauners, and here are the Schatzkins. And I said brightly, "Oh, hello, Elke." And these are the Fauners, Philip and Watson, and they had to shake hands. I'm proud of that to this day. You know, I mean, after all, music, as Schiller said, brings all people together. People are brothers in music. I mean, how can you even think of ideologies when you're listening to Beethoven, you know?
When we moved in here, the Potters, who lived down by you,
Yeah.
came up to say hello and to welcome us, and they said, "Oh, the Beetlemans, whose house you're living in, they have such lovely gardens. They took care of the gardens so much." Terrible politics. The Potters were socialists, and the Beetlemans were communists. Terrible politics, but very nice garden.
Well,
But as far as anybody down there knows, they're just all Reds.
well, I've come to the end, except there's a coda to all of this, and that is what has survived. And of course the playground has survived, and of course I'm very happy that you people have revived the Mount Airy Association, even though it looks quite different today than it did then. You're much taller. What else has survived? I'll come to something in a moment. Just to get back to Spain, you don't realize it, that anarchism is alive and well in Spain. It has shown tremendous staying power in Catalonia. And you know, Catalonia wants to be a separate state. They're trying to be independent, and of course Spain doesn't want that. They have their own language and traditions, and anarchism is still alive in Spain, of all places. We visited Spain some years ago, and I saw a poster of a meeting of anarchists. I mean, you don't see that anywhere in the world anymore. It's truly amazing. And I think it has survived in people like you who are interested in history and honor the people who came before you. Some of you are probably related to the people who were settlers here in the early days. And it lives on in America in a way that is surprising. Occupy Wall Street, that was an anarchist movement. That was started by anarchists. A peaceful demonstration against the power of money and business in this country, which is tremendous, and we all know it, that the corporations are more powerful than the government and really say what should be done most of the time. It is alive. It comes up every once in a while in a kind of unsurprising way. Carl and I went twice to Occupy Wall Street. It was so exciting. And you saw all these mostly young people who were all fired up. And they had food going there, and there was a spirit of mutual aid that was truly cheering. So you never know, but it may come back. The other really big achievement, I think, was the Hessian Hill School. That was started by two women who lived right here, next door, Elizabeth Moose and Margaret Hatfield. They were not like the other small Russian Jews. They were well-to-do middle-class people, and even rich, I suppose. There were several rich people who settled here because they were attracted to the ideas and ideals. And it was they who kind of put themselves behind the school, because when you start a school, you need money. Although school started very modestly in Elizabeth Moose's garage. Is it still there?
Yes.
That's wonderful.
No,
Thank you.
It's a house.
It's my house now.
Yeah. But I started in that garage.
Yeah, in what is it, my current garage?
Yes.
Oh,
No, that house that they have was a garage.
Yes,
And then it became a house.
Yes. I have concrete floors, I can attest.
Okay. And that didn't last long because so many people wanted to enroll their children, so they had to look for a bigger place, and they bought an old farmhouse where Temple Israel is now. They were there, and the school made a big impact, and it grew in
What year
1930.
was this that it started?
Hmm?
Do you know the year that the school started?
When-
1925,
Oh, was that early?
yes.
Okay.
I want to say a little bit more about it. That building was burned down. Nobody knows how or why, but it burned to the ground. And a new house was built, which is now Temple Israel, by a very then famous architect, William Lescas, of the Bauhaus style of architecture. Laura knows all about him. Her father was a partner in the firm. But in any case, that school became quite famous. It was unusual, even among the progressive education schools, because it was in the country. All the other schools were in cities. There were several in New York City. My husband, Bill Cotton, taught at the Walden School. It was a famous progressive school for 40 years. And there were some in Boston and some in Chicago, but the children could never go out. The Walden students could go to Central Park because it was right there. But the Hessian Hill School was in the country, and the children could grow vegetables, they could keep animals, they could help build a barn, they could live in the woods. They had nature all around them, which was terribly important, really, in the whole thinking of the progressive education teachers. Of course, Americans were very influenced by John Dewey, who is credited with the original ideas for progressive education. Ferrer did his part. In American progressive education schools, very similar ideals were pursued. Of course, learning by doing is a slogan that doesn't begin to tell what progressive education is all about, but it's kind of very basic. There are many other things that really are important. The arts, as a vehicle for personality development, played a huge role in progressive education. Participation. At the Hessian Hill School, the children helped in the cafeteria. They helped clean the place. They took care of things. They worked together. These are all ideals of progressive education: participation and learning to work with others. The individual is very important, but it's equally important to learn to work with others. The goal of that education is people who are self-confident and self-reliant, work well with others, and become citizens in a democracy. That is the ideal of progressive education. There's no other country that has these goals for their students, because in most countries, school is strictly academic oriented. Now, people say, yeah, but what about academic education? Where is that? I mean, did they teach it? Of course they did. But it wasn't the kind of iron-bound, repetitive learning or anything like that. As a matter of fact, most children learn those things just by doing what they're doing. It doesn't take a lot of formal classes to learn a lot of things. So those are some of the ideals. Did I leave something out? Oh, James Stevenson, the wonderful writer and artist who supplied hundreds of cartoons to the New Yorker over many decades, was a student at the Hessian Hill School. He wrote the most charming memorial about it. I'll leave it here so you can look at it. It's hilarious. Many people, parents, moved to Croton so that their children could go to the Hessian Hill School. Many famous people, many artists, of course, many professors, many people who valued this kind of education for their children moved here. Many teachers from all over the world came. They were inspired. They wanted to teach here, and they did. They had all kinds of people as teachers. The principal.
Ethelstein's shop teacher at Hessian Hills was Wharton Eschrick.
That is so wonderful.
Isn't that incredible? Yeah, he's a fantastic woodworker and just
one of the
legendary.
great American wood artists. There were others. A famous painter, I can't think of his name, who lived in Croton for a while. Really famous.
One of your Biddle?
Porter.
No.
Oh, Fairfield Porter?
Fairfield Porter.
Oh, really?
His sons went to the Hessian Hill School. And of course, Jim wrote this wonderful piece, which appeared on the opinion page of the New Yorker, of the Times, New York Times. I corresponded with him over many years. I wanted him to come back to Croton and give us a talk, but he said, I'm too old, I'm too this, I'm too that. But one day, when I wasn't in my shop, a man appeared, my daughter Amy was there, and he said, do you have any books by James Stevenson? And she did. And then he said, I am James Stevenson. He did come back just at one time. But we missed him. He's passed away quite a few years ago. Francis Horvich, who had a show on television, Ding Dong School, was principal of the school for a while. But it was essentially a creation by Elizabeth Moose, who was a trained teacher, educator. She was also a communist. And I think that although there's nothing to do with anything about the school, she was fairly rigid in her ideological makeup, and that didn't sit well with some of the people later, and they forced her to resign. But it basically was her creation, and she should be given credit for it. It was a wonderful school and a terrible tragedy that it folded.
When did it fold?
1952.
Okay.
A year before we moved here. I think that's the end of the story.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic.
The man who lived here before Brian and Lale, he was a Kelly. Was he
Yeah,
related to the
related.
original Kellys?
No,
No.
No?
there are many Kellys in this world. It was George
Harry
Kelly.
didn't even come from Ireland.
Yeah.
He had no Irish blood at all.
Just sounded good.
He just happened to be Celtic.
Should I pass this around?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Are there any other questions? Oh,
Yes, you mentioned how music can bring people together. Well, the Croton Shakespeare Festival was an example of bringing this socialists and communists who hated each other, and even more because the people down in the town hated them all, couldn't tell the difference. A communist and a socialist, including the socialist you mentioned, Elke Shatskin and Laura Berliner and my mother were co-chairman of the Shakespeare Festival one year. It was a stretch, but it would. And another thing that was very formative at that time was the Peekskill ride, ropes and singing, and the violence that broke out with the support of the local police. I was in the Croton High School in the years where they're still reacting to that and to the McCarthy events, the 50s, and the students would be not coming to blows, but the parents, the combat of the parents and the mistrust, like what you said about Lois Simons and don't go to these people's houses, that was very evident. And the thing that you said about the religious leaders bringing things together and finally causing this part of the Croton history to be recognized, I remember seeing I think it was in the Corton Town Hall, maybe 10 years ago, a really balanced presentation of Robeson and the fact that he wasn't even a communist, but what had happened to him and the history of the riots, really, which had been suppressed, but finally it even made it to an official exhibit.
yes, thank you. That was in 1949, and it took place mostly outside Peekskill, but many people from Croton had gone to hear him sing, and they had a hard time getting home because people threw rocks at the cars, and some people were wounded. there was a terrible feeling. I mean, it was almost like a civil war.
Mike and Ann Potter tell the story of people in Croton coming into Mount Airy looking for dented cars, and how they hid their car in what was a little tiny garage into their house at the time. They were really quite terrified because the mobs came through these trails looking to see if they could find people who might have attended that Peekskill event.
Yes,
And I remember people telling me they didn't dare go to the local hospital for help because they're afraid their car would be recognized and found there, and they proceeded as if they could to New York City.
yeah, those were fearful days. I'm glad they're over. And I hope we never get anything like that again. I wanted to say something else, and I've forgotten what it is. I don't have Alzheimer's, but
That's what they all say.
that's what they all say. And I forget names and things, but it usually comes back to me. That is a sign that I don't have it. And it comes back. When it doesn't come back, you can say goodbye. I wanted to, of course, I'm looking straight at him. He's a graduate of the Hessian Hill School.
Oh, yeah. I wonder if anyone else here went to the Hessian Hill School.
Richard Salzburg did.
Yeah. I was there for a semester, and then I transferred to kindergarten at the PVC. And I think the school hadn't quite closed then. That would be about 1950, approximately 1950. But maybe they weren't offering kindergarten anymore. So I transferred in the middle of the semester to PVC. It was just about when it was closing.
Well, here's a prime example of what becomes of people when they go to the Hessian Hill School as babies.
You were hired at IBM by an Eric Wagner? Wait, is that his last name?
I don't think so.
Who was he said he and a group of people had hired you.
Oh,
at
well, maybe he was
IBM.
involved in the decision of it, yeah.
Yeah, and he was a
He
Hessian
was
Hills
a- yeah.
graduate. He went to Hessian Hill School, and then to North Country School, where some people who had been running the Hessian Hill School started North Country School up in the Adirondack, and Kaplan money.
Now, what do you remember about Louis Ismay? He was a principal at the Hessian Hill School, near
I
the
know
time it
nothing about
closed, yeah.
him.
Okay.
Yeah, he may have been one of the last ones. Lionel Tibbetts was a principal for a few years, and he knew the school was closing and it was doomed. And he looked for a new job, and the Walden School needed a new principal, and he was hired. And that's how my husband discovered Croton. And he said, "Oh, we want to live here too." But Vinyl became the new principal of Walden, and we moved to Croton.
Oh, interesting.
Now, I notice, Alex, where did that thing come from? That is amazing, that,
Oh, that original incorporation document. I was talking to Jim Callow, and he said, he'd been already held every member of the position of the board at some point over the years. And he said, yeah, it's been sitting in my garage for 25 years. I said, yeah, that's probably not the best place for it. Just bring it over. And that, like half an hour later, he was at the door. Here you go. So, and I'm actually passing it on, Ian. You're taking that home.
Okay.
Yeah. So it should. Well, no, it should live with the president.
Live with the president. All right.
Maybe the historical
Maybe eventually. Sure.
Well, belongs to the association.
This talk should also go. Thank you, Cornelia. I have to do that.
I'm afraid I have to leave.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.